Imagine being the person who has to tell the entire galactic leadership that their civilization will cease to exist in exactly 30 days, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. That's the position Ambassador Reth found himself in one cold morning, when the war projections finally came through, and what happened next would change the galaxy forever. Reth was a Valorian, a species known for their analytical minds and their distinctive silver neural filaments that cascaded from their scalps like metallic waterfalls, and right now every single one of those filaments was rigid with the horror of what he was seeing on the holographic display in front of him. The numbers didn't lie, they never did, and these numbers told a story of inevitable extinction. The war between the Ascension Collective, who wanted to convert every star into massive computational matrices to achieve digital immortality, and the Preservation Alliance, who believed in allowing organic life to flourish naturally across the galaxy, had been raging for 3 standard years, and Reth's side, the Preservation Alliance, was losing catastrophically. He stood alone in the Strategic Analysis Chamber, a room designed to hold 50 analysts, but currently occupied only by him, and the damning data scrolling across multiple screens, and the word that tore from his throat echoed off the crystalline walls with a desperation that surprised even him. No. His sapphire eyes, evolved to see into the ultraviolet spectrum, tracked across the battlefield simulations, the resource depletion charts, the casualty projections, and every single data point confirmed what his brilliant mind had already calculated. They had 30 days, maybe less, before Supreme Commander Vix and his Ascension Collective broke through their final defensive lines and began the systematic conversion of every Preservation Alliance world into computational substrate. Reth's fingers moved before his conscious mind caught up, dancing across the communication console with practiced precision, pulling up contact after contact, and within minutes he had assembled an emergency session with representatives from all 14 species of the Preservation Alliance, their faces appearing in a grid formation on the massive display screen, each one showing various degrees of confusion and irritation at being summoned so abruptly. There was Ambassador Torvin of the crystalline lithoids, his geometric body refracting light in agitated patterns, and Senator Mira of the aquatic deepkin, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with concern in her pressurized environment suit, and Representative Krell of the insectoid hive spawn, his compound eyes reflecting the light in fractured patterns, and 9 others, each representing millions or billions of citizens who had no idea their time was running out. Ambassador Reth, what is the meaning of this? Torvin's voice came through with the characteristic chiming quality of his species, each word like crystalline bells. I was in the middle of critical negotiations with the Deepkin about resource allocation. This better be important. The others began voicing similar complaints, their words overlapping into a cacophony of alien languages and translator glitches, and Reth just stood there, letting them vent, letting them have their moment of irritation, because in 30 seconds they would understand, and then irritation would seem like a luxury they could no longer afford. He took a breath, his neural filaments settling against his shoulders in a gesture of grim determination. And then he spoke with a clarity that cut through the noise like a laser through fog. We will lose this war in exactly 30 standard days if we don't do something radical right now. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Every voice stopped mid-sentence. Every face on the screen went still, even Senator Mira's bioluminescent patterns froze in mid-pulse, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that only comes when people hear something they desperately don't want to believe. That's impossible. Someone said. Reth wasn't even sure who, because he was already transmitting the data, flooding their systems with the analyses, the projections, the mathematical certainty of their defeat. Or intelligence suggests we're holding the line, our forces are. The objections started to build, denials rising in volume and intensity. But Reth watched as their expressions changed, as their own analytical systems processed the data he'd sent, as the terrible truth began to sink in through layers of denial and hope. And he knew the exact moment when each of them understood, because their faces showed it. The lithoid's crystal structure dimmed. The Deepkin's bioluminescence shifted to distress colors, the hive spawn's antennae drooped, and the others all had their own species, specific tells that screamed of fear and desperation. Supreme Commander Vix has unified the entire Ascension Collective under a single command structure for the first time in the war. Reith explained, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest. He's the most brilliant military strategist any of us have seen in generations, and he's been using the last 6 months to consolidate forces, optimize supply lines, and prepare for a final, overwhelming offensive. Look at the data, really look at it. See how he's positioned his fleets, how he's timing his attacks, how every battle we think we're winning is actually just him shaping the battlefield for the killing blow. It was Ambassador Lissa of the Avian Skyborn who spoke first, her feathered crest fully extended in alarm, her multiple vocal cords creating harmonics that the translator struggled to render. If your analysis is correct, and I'm not saying it isn't, but if it is, what do you propose we do? We can't just surrender. The Ascension Collective will convert our worlds, upload our consciousnesses whether we consent or not. That's not survival, that's obliteration of everything we are. Others were nodding, their various forms of body language all conveying the same desperate agreement, and Reth felt the weight of what he was about to suggest settle on his shoulders like a physical burden, because, once he said it, once he put it out there would be no taking it back. He spread his arms wide, his neural filaments lifting and spreading in a display of absolute conviction. And he said the words that would change everything. We ask humanity for help. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock or disbelief. This was the silence of a room full of highly intelligent beings trying to process something so unexpected, so unprecedented, that their brains simply needed a moment to reboot, and Reth could almost see the calculations running behind their eyes. The risk assessments, the historical analyses, the desperate hope warring with practical skepticism. Humanity. Representative Krell's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of confusion in his species, the species that left the Galactic Council 1700 standard years ago, the ones who sealed their borders and stopped participating in galactic affairs entirely. Why would they help us? They made it abundantly clear they wanted nothing to do with the rest of the galaxy. Reith had anticipated this question, had spent his sleepless night preparing for every objection, and his response came immediately. Because the Ascension Collective won't stop with us, once they've converted our territory. Once they've achieved their goal of transforming organic life into computational substrate. What's to stop them from moving into the neutral zones? Humanity may have isolated themselves, but they're still biological beings, they still exist in physical space. And the Ascension Collective's ideology doesn't allow for exceptions. Eventually, inevitably, they'll come for Earth and all human worlds. Humanity has every reason to help us because helping us helps themselves. Ambassador Torvin's crystalline structure was refracting light in patterns that suggested deep thought, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its irritation, replaced by careful consideration. That explains why they might have interest in our survival, but you're making a huge assumption that they have the capability to help. Reth, they've been isolated for over a millennium and a half. For all we know, they've declined technologically, or maybe they've advanced but not in military applications. Maybe they've become pacifists who couldn't help, even if they wanted to. How can you be sure that contacting them isn't just a waste of our precious time? And this was the moment, the fulcrum point where everything would either come together or fall apart, and Reth leaned forward, his neural filaments spreading wider, his sapphire eyes blazing with intensity as he delivered the argument he'd been building toward. 2,000 standard years ago, when humanity first achieved faster than light travel and joined the Galactic Council, they were already ahead of everyone else militarily, not by a small margin. By orders of magnitude, they had weapons systems we couldn't understand, defensive technologies that made their vessels nearly invulnerable. Tactical doctrines that rewrote our understanding of space combat. And that was when they were barely out of their home system, when they were still figuring out how to navigate the stars. He paused, letting that sink in, watching their faces as they remembered the old stories. The legends that had been passed down through generations of diplomats and military strategists. And then he continued. "No, imagine what they've developed in the 1700 years since, while we've been locked in political struggles and ideological debates, while we've been fighting wars with incrementally improved versions of the same basic technologies, they've been advancing in isolation, improving, innovating, evolving. If they were gods of war when they were galactic newcomers, what are they now? What could a species with that head start and that much time in isolation have achieved?" The silence stretched, and Reth could see the shift happening. The hope beginning to kindle in eyes that had been dead with despair just minutes before, and Senator Mira's bioluminescence shifted to colors that suggested cautious optimism as she said, "We need to vote on this. It's too important for one representative to decide unilaterally. But Reth is right. We're out of options. If there's even a chance that humanity can help, we have to take it." The vote was called, and Reth watched as the indicators appeared next to each representative's image. Green for approval, red for rejection, amber for abstention, and his heart hammered in his chest as the colors populated green, 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 amber, green, 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 amber, green. 12 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 rejections. "It's decided then," Representative Krell said, his mandibles clicking in what might have been approval or might have been anxiety. "Well, contact humanity. But Reth, this was your analysis, your insight, your proposal. You should be the one to make first contact. You'll know what to say, how to ask, what to offer." Reeth's neural filaments went completely still, which was unusual enough that several representatives noticed and exchanged glances. Because he hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for this, but as soon as it was said he knew it was right, knew that he couldn't ask someone else to take on a burden he'd created.
"Yes,"
he said simply, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll contact them. I'll make them understand what's at stake." 5 standard days later, Reth stood alone in the primary docking facility of Alliance Station Prime, a massive structure that could accommodate 300 warships simultaneously. And right now every single one of those berths was empty, because he'd ordered them cleared. And if he was wrong about this, if humanity didn't respond or responded with hostility, or responded with forces insufficient to the task, his career would be over, his reputation destroyed. But those concerns seemed trivial compared to the extinction of organic life in this entire sector. The negotiation with humanity had been surreal in its brevity. He'd sent a carefully crafted message through the old diplomatic channels that hadn't been used in over a millennium, explaining the situation in detail, providing tactical data, strategic analyses, projections of what would happen if the Ascension Collective won, and he'd expected days or weeks of back and forth, expected humanity to demand concessions or territory or resources in exchange for assistance. But instead he'd received a response in less than 8 hours. And the message had been shockingly simple. "Send us the coordinates where you need us. We'll handle it from there. The problem you've described will be resolved." That was it. No negotiation of terms, no discussion of payment, no demands for post-war arrangements. Just calm acknowledgement and acceptance. And Reth didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified, because that level of confidence suggested either delusion or capabilities so far beyond galactic standard that they couldn't even conceive of failure as a possibility. He checked the chronometer for the 15th time in as many minutes, his neural filaments twitching with anxiety, and the appointed meeting time came and went. 5 minutes late. 10, 15, and the doubt that had been gnawing at him began to grow teeth, began to whisper that he'd been a fool, that humanity wasn't coming, that he'd wasted precious time on a desperate gambit that would fail. Then his communicator chirped, the sound absurdly cheerful in the tense silence, and the docking facility controller's voice crackled through. "Ambassador, Reth, we're detecting a spatial anomaly. Something's coming through, proximity alert. Should be visual in moments." Relief flooded through him so intensely that his neural filaments actually drooped with the release of tension, and he spun toward the facility's massive opening, the force field that separated vacuum from atmosphere, shimmering faintly in his vision, and he watched as space itself seemed to ripple, to fold, to bend in ways that made his eyes hurt to process. And then a ship emerged, just one ship, a single vessel that looked remarkably unremarkable. Reth felt his relief curdle into confusion, then into something approaching panic, because he'd cleared 300 berths expecting a fleet, expecting hundreds of warships, expecting an armada that could challenge the Ascension Collective's might, but instead there was one ship, medium-sized by galactic standards, maybe classified as a light cruiser or heavy corvette, with a hull that seemed to be made of something that flowed like liquid metal, reflecting light in strange ways, but otherwise completely ordinary. No obvious weapon emplacements, no massive engine arrays, no distinctive markings that screamed human warship. Just a ship, singular, alone, insufficient. The vessel descended with a smoothness that seemed to defy physics. No visible thrust, no gravitational distortion, just movement as if gravity itself had decided to gently lower it to the docking bay floor. And the landing was equally strange. The ship simply settled onto the surface without any of the usual repulsor wash or engine burn. And Reth realized with growing concern that he couldn't identify the propulsion system at all, couldn't see how it moved, or what made it move. Which was concerning because he had 17 advanced degrees in applied physics and astrophysics, and he should at least recognize the principles involved. A seam appeared in the hull, flowing open like water parting, and a ramp extended downward with that same liquid metal quality, and a human emerged, and Reth felt a jolt of recognition because he'd studied human physiology in preparation for this meeting. But seeing one in person was different. The human was tall, easily 2 meters, with dark skin that seemed to absorb light, hair cropped short against his skull, and eyes that were a striking amber color that seemed almost to glow in the docking bay's lighting. "Ambassador Reth," the human called out, his voice carrying across the space with surprising clarity. "I'm Commander Marcus Kane. Sorry we're a bit late. Navigation calculations took longer than expected. Turns out your coordinates use a slightly different reference frame than what we're used to." The human approached with long, easy strides, completely relaxed, as if he were arriving for a casual meeting, rather than a mission to save an entire civilization from extinction. And Reth found himself extending his hand in the human greeting gesture, feeling the warm, firm grip, the casual strength that spoke of a species that still valued physical fitness, even after millennia of technological advancement. "Commander Kane," Wraith said, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to show his growing panic. "I appreciate your punctuality, despite the navigational challenges. If you'll show me to your transport shuttle, I'm ready to depart immediately to join your fleet. Time is critical, as I'm sure you understand." The human's expression shifted to confusion, his head tilting slightly in what Reth had learned was a gesture of puzzlement in human body language, and Kane said, "Transport shuttle. What fleet? I'm confused, Ambassador. This is it, my ship, my crew. We're here to resolve your situation. We don't need a fleet for this kind of operation." Reth stared at him, his neural filaments going rigid with shock, and the words came out before he could stop them. "One ship. You brought one ship to fight the entire Ascension Collective, to face Supreme Commander Vix and his thousands of warships. Is this some kind of joke? Did I offend humanity somehow in my request? Because if so, I apologize profusely, but please, we're desperate, billions of lives are at stake, this isn't the time for." Kane held up a hand, and something in the gesture, some quality of absolute confidence, made Reth stop mid-sentence, and the human's expression had shifted from confusion to understanding. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Ambassador, I promise you, this isn't a joke and you haven't offended us. The truth is simple. We don't need more than one ship for this. My crew and I can handle it. I know how that sounds. I can see from your expression that you think we're insane or deluded. But I'm asking you to trust us. Come aboard. Let me show you what we can do. And I think you'll understand." Before Reth could formulate another protest, Kane was guiding him toward the ramp with a gentle hand on his shoulder, and Reth found himself being led despite every logical objection screaming in his mind, because what else could he do? This was the only option left, the only card left to play. Even if it was a card that made no sense, that violated every principle of military strategy he'd ever learned. The ramp beneath his feet felt wrong as he walked up it. Not wrong in a bad way, but strange, as if he were walking on something that wasn't quite solid. And when he looked down, he saw the surface rippling slightly under his weight, flowing outward like water, but supporting him perfectly, and his physicist's mind immediately recognized what he was seeing. Programmable matter. Matter that could change its properties on demand. And he'd seen experimental versions in laboratories, but nothing like this, nothing that functioned so smoothly, so perfectly. They crossed the threshold into the ship, and Reth heard a sound like water pouring. And he turned to see the ramp liquefying, flowing back into the hull, and within seconds there was no ramp at all. The hull was seamless, perfectly smooth. The metal had sealed itself, with the precision of water finding its level, and Reth felt his hands trembling. Because programmable matter of this sophistication was theoretical, was something researchers dreamed about but couldn't achieve, and humanity was using it for their ship's hull, casually, as if it were standard technology. Impressive, right? Kane said, catching Reth's stare. Standard hull configuration makes repairs trivial, because the ship can literally heal itself. Also means we have no structural weak points, from joints or seams. The entire hull is one continuous adaptive surface. Anyway, come on. Let me introduce you to the crew. They moved through corridors that seemed to adjust their dimensions as they walked, the walls maintaining a constant, comfortable distance, regardless of their exact path. The lighting coming from nowhere, Reth could identify, emanating from the walls themselves and adjusting to optimal levels automatically. And everything was smooth, flowing, organic in a way that ships simply weren't supposed to be, and Reth's scientific mind was cataloging impossibilities with every step. Kane opened a door, and they stepped onto the bridge, and Reth stopped dead, his neural filaments going rigid again because there were 6 humans at their stations. Just 6. 6 people to crew an entire starship. No teams of tactical officers. No backup crews, no redundant systems with multiple operators. Just 6 individuals in ergonomic chairs arranged in an efficient pattern around a central command station. Everyone. This is Ambassador Reth, Kane announced with the same casual ease he'd shown throughout, as if this were a social introduction rather than a military briefing. Reth, let me introduce my crew. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka on navigation. She's the one who figured out your coordinate system. Sergeant James Wilson on tactical. He's got steady hands and good instincts. Specialist Aisha Okoi on engineering. She keeps this beautiful beast running smoothly. Corporal Liu Chen on communications and sensors. His language processing skills are unmatched. Dr. Sarah Cohen on science and analysis. She's here to make sure we understand what we're dealing with. And Private First Class Dakota Rivers on support systems. She handles everything else. 6 names, 6 faces, 6 humans who apparently believed they were sufficient to accomplish what hundreds of thousands of soldiers had failed to do over 3 years of brutal warfare. And Reth wanted to laugh or cry or both because this was insane, this was beyond insane, this was delusional. Commander Kane, please. Reeth began, his voice rising with desperate urgency. I appreciate humanity's willingness to help. Truly I do, but 6 people cannot fight an entire fleet. The mathematics of combat don't work that way. Numbers matter. Firepower matters. You can't overcome thousands of warships with 1 crew, no matter how skilled they are. Please. If this is all humanity can spare, then at least let me contact my superiors. We need to adjust our strategy. We need to. Kane settled into the command chair, and something about the way he moved, the absolute confidence in his posture, made Reth's objections die in his throat, and the commander said, Lieutenant Tanaka, take us to the front line, full speed, let's show the ambassador what we can do. Aye, Commander. Tanaka responded, her fingers dancing across her console, and then the universe broke. There was no other way to describe it. Reality itself seemed to fold. Space twisted in ways that violated every principle of physics. Reth had spent his life studying. Colors that shouldn't exist flashed at the edges of his vision. His inner ear rebelled against the impossible geometry. His neural filaments read involuntarily. And then, just as suddenly, Everything stabilized, and through the main viewport, he saw the familiar distortion patterns of hyperspace, the not quite colors of faster than light travel. But they had been inside the docking facility. Ships didn't enter hyperspace from inside stations. The gravitational interference would tear both vessels and structures apart. You had to clear the gravity well, achieve minimum safe distance. It was basic physics, fundamental principles that every species in the galaxy understood and obeyed. We were. The docking bay. Reth couldn't form complete sentences. His mind was fragmenting under the assault of impossible events. Ships can't do that. The gravitational shear would. Kane looked at him with genuine surprise. As if Reth had just questioned why they bothered to breathe or why they used doors instead of walking through walls. And he said, "Why would we waste time undocking conventionally? This is standard emergency deployment protocol. Has been for the last 400 years. Get where you need to be immediately from wherever you are. Gravity wells are irrelevant once you've mastered local space folding." The crew was exchanging glances, and Wilson turned in his chair, his expression showing concern. "Commander, I don't think he knew we could do that. I don't think any of them can do that." "That can't be right," Cohen said, her fingers moving across her console. "Local space manipulation is fundamental. Every sufficiently advanced civilization should have developed it by now. It's just applied gravitational field theory. Check the database," Chen suggested, his eyes scanning through information. "According to our intelligence, galactic standard is still to achieve minimum safe distance before FTL engagement. They actually burn time escaping gravity wells before jumping." "That's..." Tanaka paused, searching for words. "That's incredibly inefficient. That would add hours to deployment times. Why would anyone still do it that way?" "Focus, people," Kane said, though his tone was amused rather than sharp. "We can discuss the galaxy's technological plateau later. Right now we have a war to end. Lieutenant Tanaka, EDA to front line." 37 seconds, Commander." 37 seconds to travel what should take days? And Reth just gripped the nearest console, his neural filaments wrapping around his arms in an unconscious gesture of self-comfort. Because he'd asked for humanity's help, and apparently he'd summoned something so far beyond galactic civilization that they operated on principles the rest of the galaxy hadn't discovered or couldn't discover, and he didn't know whether to feel hope or terror. "Emergence in 3, 2, 1, mark," Tanaka announced, and reality twisted again, and they dropped out of hyperspace directly into hell itself. The viewport filled with thousands of ships. Ascension collective vessels in perfect military formations, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of stars converted to computational matrices. Their weapon systems active and ready, and they had emerged right in the center of it all, surrounded on all sides by hostile forces that outnumbered them by thousands to one. Panic hit Reth like a physical force, his neural filaments going completely rigid, his sapphire eyes widening until they hurt, and he heard himself screaming, "You've killed us all! We need to jump away. Now, they'll destroy us in seconds. We're surrounded." Warning indicators were already flashing on multiple screens, hundreds of enemy ships locking weapons, missiles launching in waves, energy weapons pivoting on their mounts, targeting solutions being calculated and executed, and death was incoming from every direction simultaneously. Kane looked at him with that same expression of gentle confusion, as if Reth had just said something incomprehensible, and he asked, "Why are you panicking, Ambassador? We just need to activate phase shift, we'll be fine." "Phase shift," Reith heard himself say, his voice high and breaking with stress. "What's phase shift? What are you?" Kane nodded to his crew, and they all moved simultaneously, their fingers dancing across their consoles in perfect synchronization. And something changed. Something Reth couldn't see but could feel in his body. The air felt different. Thicker, or maybe thinner. Physics itself seemed to be looking at them differently. Light had a quality that his eyes couldn't quite process. His neural filaments moved through space and left distortions that shouldn't exist. Trails that faded almost instantly, but were definitely there. The missiles were seconds away, thousands of them converging on their exact location, and Reth squeezed his eyes shut, his filaments wrapping around his head in a futile gesture of protection, waiting for the impact that would vaporize them all, and the moment came and nothing happened. No explosion, no hull breach, no death, just silence. "You can look now, Ambassador," Kane said gently. "It's safe." Rith opened his eyes and saw the missiles passing through their position. All of them, thousands of high, explosive warheads, just flying through the space where their ship existed, as if they weren't there at all. And then the energy weapons opened fire, hundreds of lasers, and particle beams, and plasma lances creating a web of concentrated death that should have vaporized them instantly, and every single beam passed through their ship like they were ghosts, like they existed in some other dimension that merely overlapped with this one. What? Reth couldn't finish the question, couldn't even formulate what he was trying to ask, because he was watching reality violate its own rules, watching weapons that should kill them harmlessly pass through their position as if they weren't really there. "Phase shift technology," Kane explained, his tone patient and educational. "As far as we know, it's unique to humanity. We've never encountered another species that has it. What you're seeing is the application of quantum superposition principles to macroscopic objects. We're essentially existing in a quantum state, where we're both here, and not here, simultaneously. From the perspective of normal matter, we're intangible. We literally cannot interact with conventional physics." He gestured to the viewport where the weapons' fire continued to pass through them harmlessly. "Their weapons go through us because we're not really here in the way they understand here. We're occupying the same space, but in a different quantum state. It's like, imagine if you could give the properties of neutrinos, particles that pass through entire planets without interacting, to a ship and its crew. That's essentially what phase shift does." The implications crashed through Reth's mind like a tidal wave, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. "With technology like this, you could have conquered the galaxy, easily. No defense could stop you. No weapon could touch you. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why didn't you?" The humans all smiled, and it wasn't a cruel smile or a mocking smile. It was knowing and amused and absolutely confident, and Wilson said, "Oh, we're very aware of that, Ambassador. Trust me, we know exactly what we could do." A cold sensation ran down Reth's spine and through his neural filaments, because these people, this species, had possessed the capability to conquer the known galaxy for at least 400 years based on what Kane had said. Probably longer. They had held absolute military supremacy, and they had chosen to do nothing with it, had simply isolated themselves and pursued their own development. And the restraint that implied was almost more terrifying than the power itself. "What do we do now?" Reith asked, his voice surprisingly steady, and Kane stood from his command chair, moved to a control interface, and his hands wrapped around it with practiced ease, his eyes locking onto a particular section of the battlespace. "Now," Kane said, his voice taking on a tone of finality, "we end this war." The ship moved, and Reth felt the acceleration, but it was gentle, controlled, nothing like the violent maneuvers of conventional combat. And they were heading directly toward a vessel at the center of the Ascension collective formation. A ship that was easily 50 times their size, bristling with weapons, surrounded by escort vessels and defensive screens, and Reth realized with a jolt what he was looking at. Supreme Commander Vix's flagship. The command center of the entire Ascension collective fleet. They passed through the defensive perimeter like it didn't exist, force fields designed to stop everything from missiles to boarding pods. Just ignored them. Escort ships fired frantically, and their weapons did nothing. The flagship itself opened up with every weapon system it had, point defense creating a curtain of fire that should have shredded any approaching vessel, and Kane piloted them through it all with calm precision. His movements economical and sure. They approached the flagship's hull, meters of reinforced armor designed to withstand antimatter warheads, and they phased through it like passing through air, through shields that could deflect planet-killing weapons, through hull plating that could survive being rammed by asteroids, through it all as if it were made of smoke and dreams. And then they were inside the enemy flagship, their bridge occupying the same space as the enemy's command center. two realities overlapping in a way that made Reth's eyes hurt to process. And there he was, Supreme Commander Vix himself, a Cremorian with 4 arms and chitinous exoskeleton that gleamed like polished obsidian, his compound eyes wide with shock as he stared at the impossible sight before him. His bridge crew, equally stunned, some frozen at their stations, others backing away from the apparition that had materialized in their midst, a few reaching for weapons with trembling appendages. Kane moved with casual confidence to a storage compartment, pulled out what was clearly a weapon. A handgun by the look of it, sleek and obviously human, made with no visible power source or ammunition port, and he checked it with quick efficiency before turning toward Supreme Commander Vix. And he raised the weapon and fired. The shot was a spike of brilliant blue light, gone in an instant, but unlike everything else in phase, shift mode, unlike the humans and their ship that existed in intangible quantum states, the energy bolt was solid and real, and it slammed into the flagship's primary tactical console. With a shower of sparks and the scream of melting circuits, the station exploded in a cascade of debris, and suddenly the enemy bridge crew was moving, panic overriding shock. Weapons appeared from everywhere, the Ascension Collective crew highly trained and experienced, reacting with admirable speed, sidearms and backup rifles in emergency. Weapon lockers all accessed in seconds. Dozens of weapons aimed at the humans, at Kane in particular, and they fired energy beams and projectile rounds and plasma charges filling the air with deadly force from every angle. And the humans just stood there, smiling as every shot passed through them, harmlessly. Minutes passed as the enemy crew fired and fired until their weapons overheated or ran dry, their panic increasing with each ineffective attack. And Reth watched as the reality of their situation sank in, as they realized they were fighting something they couldn't touch, couldn't harm, couldn't even understand, and weapons started being dropped, others held in nerveless appendages, the fight draining out of them like water from a broken vessel. Kane waited for the shooting to stop completely, for the silence to ring through the bridge, and then he spoke with a voice that was calm and pleasant and utterly terrifying in its casualness. Supreme Commander Vix, you have 2 choices here. You can surrender now, order your entire fleet to stand down, and we can all go home. Or I can keep shooting things on your bridge until you do, and can you imagine that? Being remembered by history as the brilliant strategist who lost a galactic war to a guy with a handgun. The humans were all smiling now, and it was the most frightening thing Reth had ever seen because it was genuine. They were actually enjoying this, not in a cruel way, but in the way of people who knew they had already won, and were just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Vex stood at his command station, all 4 of his arms hanging limp, his compound eyes moving from Kane to the rest of the human crew to their ship that occupied the same space as his own to the destroyed console that proved they could affect his reality while he couldn't touch theirs. And Reth saw the exact moment when acceptance came, when the mathematical certainty of defeat became undeniable, even to the galaxy's greatest military mind. I surrender, Vix said quietly, then louder to his crew, transmit general ceasefire to all Ascension Collective forces, unconditional surrender. The war is over. And that was how the Galactic War ended. Not with a climactic battle that would be sung about for generations, not with a massive fleet engagement that would fill history books, but with 6 humans on one ship with technology so advanced it seemed like sorcery, with the casual confidence of a species that had achieved such heights that conventional warfare was beneath them, that had held the power to conquer the galaxy for centuries, and had chosen not to, because they simply had better things to do with their time. Reth stood on the bridge of the human ship, surrounded by people who had just accomplished the impossible with such ease. It looked like a training exercise, and he thought about what this meant for the galaxy, how the balance of power had just shifted in ways that would take generations to fully understand, because humanity had reminded everyone that they existed, and more importantly, had reminded everyone exactly what they were capable of when they chose to act. Kane turned to him with that easy smile still on his face, completely relaxed, as if they'd just completed a routine patrol, rather than ended a 3-year war in less than an hour. And he said, "So, Ambassador Reth, mission accomplished. Need a ride back to Alliance Station Prime." Rith's neural filaments swayed with something between profound relief and existential dread, because the galaxy had just learned that humanity wasn't isolated because they were weak, or pacifist, or uninterested. They were isolated because they had transcended the petty conflicts that consumed everyone else. And now that isolation had ended, at least temporarily, and nothing would ever be the same again, and he managed to say with a voice that only trembled slightly, "Yes, Commander Kane, I believe I do, and I think the galaxy owes humanity a debt it can never repay." Kane's smile widened and he shook his head. "No debt, Ambassador, we're just glad we could help. Besides, Vix was right about one thing. If the Ascension Collective had won, eventually they would have come for us too. This was as much in our interest as yours." And as the human ship prepared to shift back to Alliance space, carrying with it the news that would reshape galactic civilization, Reth realized that the scariest part wasn't what humanity had done today. It was what they could do if they ever decided to really get involved in galactic affairs, and he sent a silent prayer to whatever cosmic forces might be listening that humanity would continue to prefer their isolation, because a galaxy where they were active participants was a galaxy where everyone else was playing a game they couldn't possibly win.